The Nephilim were monsters clothed in flesh, driven by appetites that could never be satisfied.
Azazel taught men to forge weapons of war. The peace of Eden was shattered by the clash of bronze. The earth itself cried out under the weight of violence, screaming for a deliverance that would not come.
Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel stood before the Almighty.
The verdict was absolute. The Watchers would be bound in darkness for 70 generations.
Lord, their corruption covers the earth. But if you command it, I will go into the darkness.
Enoch found the Watchers weeping at Abel's jail. They sat with faces covered, haunted by consequences.
We have sinned, Enoch. Beg him for mercy. Ask him to spare us from the fire we kindled.
I have seen the vision. Your petition is denied. You will be bound in the earth forever.
The same God who took Enoch watches over you. Will you choose to walk with him today?
In the beginning, before the floodwaters rose to cleanse the earth, before giants walked among men and terrorized the nations, before the boundaries between heaven and earth were shattered by forbidden desire, there lived a man unlike any other in all of human history. His name was Enoch, the seventh generation from Adam, born into a world that still remembered the garden and the fall with painful clarity. He was the son of Jared, a man whose very name meant descent, for it was in the days of Jared that something descended from the heavens that would change the course of human history forever. Enoch grew up hearing whispers of strange visitors in the night, of beings who walked among mortals with eyes like burning coals and voices that echoed with the authority of another realm entirely. He did not yet understand what these whispers meant. He did not yet know that he would become the sole witness to the greatest rebellion since Lucifer fell from glory, but God had marked him from his first breath, setting him apart for a purpose that would span not only his lifetime, but all of eternity itself. The weight of heaven's darkest secrets would one day rest upon his shoulders, and he would carry them faithfully until the very end of his remarkable journey upon the earth. The world in those ancient days was not as it is now, for everything was different in ways that modern minds can scarcely comprehend. Men lived for centuries upon centuries, their lifespans stretching across generations like great rivers that refused to reach the sea. Adam himself still walked the earth when Enoch was born, his eyes heavy with the memory of paradise lost, his hands still remembering the texture of Eden's fruit that he had been forbidden to touch, his ears still haunted by the voice of God walking in the cool of the day before the serpent's deception changed everything. The knowledge of the Creator had not yet faded from human consciousness, and the line of Seth, from which Enoch descended, carried the sacred flame of righteousness through the gathering darkness that threatened to consume the world. These were the sons of God, in the truest sense of that ancient phrase, men and women who called upon the name of the Lord with genuine devotion, who built altars and offered sacrifices according to the patterns their fathers had taught them, who instructed their children in the ways of holiness in a world that was slowly but surely forgetting the divine commands. They preserved the stories of creation with careful accuracy. They remembered the promise of a seed that would one day crush the serpent's head and redeem what had been lost. They waited for redemption with patient hope. But something was terribly and unmistakably wrong. Even as a young man with limited experience of the world, Enoch sensed it in his bones. A shadow was falling over all of creation, a darkness that had nothing to do with the setting of the sun or the coming of night. The prayers of the faithful seemed to rise more slowly toward heaven than they had in the days of his grandfather, as if the atmosphere itself was thickening with something unseen and deeply malevolent. The nights grew longer and colder with each passing year. The stars seemed dimmer in the firmament above, as if they were retreating from the earth in shame at what was happening below. And in the distance, on the peaks of mountains that touched the very clouds of heaven, strange lights flickered like fallen stars that refused to die and be forgotten. Old men spoke in trembling voices of visitors from beyond the sky, of beings too beautiful to be merely human, too powerful to be ignored or resisted, too glorious to be anything but divine in origin. Women whispered in corners of encounters that left them forever changed, marked by something they could not name and could not forget, no matter how hard they tried. Children were being born throughout the land who were disturbingly different from normal offspring, larger than they should be, stronger than any child had a right to be, with hunger in their eyes that food could not satisfy and rage in their hearts that nothing could calm or control. Enoch watched with growing concern. Enoch listened with careful attention. Enoch prayed without ceasing for understanding, and heaven was watching him back with great interest. The mountain they called Hermon rose from the northern borders of the promised land, like a throne carved by the very hand of God himself in the days of creation. Its peak was crowned with eternal snow that never melted even in the fiercest heat of summer, gleaming white against the blue expanse of sky like a beacon visible for hundreds of miles in every direction. Its slopes were shrouded in mists that rolled and shifted like living things with minds of their own, hiding whatever moved within them from the sight of mortal men. The ancients who lived in its shadow believed it was a gateway between worlds, a thin place where the veil between the seen and unseen grew dangerously fragile, where heaven and earth met in proximity too close for mortal comfort. Shepherds avoided the mountain even when their flocks strayed perilously near its base. Travelers skirted around it with fearful glances upward at its shrouded peak, hurrying past as quickly as their legs could carry them to safety. Even the bravest warriors in all the land spoke of Hermon in hushed tones when they spoke of it at all, as if the mountain itself might be listening to their words and judging their courage. They were absolutely right to fear. They were absolutely right to tremble, for what happened on that summit would change absolutely everything about human existence. On a night when the stars aligned in patterns that had not been seen since the dawn of creation itself, 200 figures descended through the clouds and gathered on that sacred and terrible summit. They moved without making any sound whatsoever, gliding through the frozen air like shadows given form and substance. They cast no shadows of their own upon the pristine snow beneath their feet. Their footsteps touched the white expanse, but left no prints to mark their passage. Their eyes burned with an inner fire that was clearly not of this world or any world that humans had ever known. They were not men, despite their appearance. They were watchers, a specialized class of angelic beings assigned by the Most High God to observe humanity from the heights of heaven where they had dwelt since their creation. Their sacred purpose was to guard and guide the human race without direct interference, to watch but never touch, to report but never act on their own initiative. They had existed since before the earth was formed from chaos and void, had sung the songs of creation when the morning stars shouted together for joy at the birth of the world, had witnessed with their own eyes the fall of Lucifer and the tragic expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden. They knew the laws of heaven better than any creature in all of existence. They knew precisely and completely the terrible consequences of rebellion against the Almighty, and yet they chose to fall. Their names were recorded in the chronicles of eternity that exist in the vaults of heaven, names that would be spoken with horror and disgust for millennia to come. Semjaza stood first among them, their acknowledged leader, whose name meant he who sees the name, a reference to the sacred and unutterable name of God that he had once beheld in glory beyond description. Azazel stood beside him, the fierce one, keeper of forbidden knowledge and dark secrets, whose brilliance had once illuminated the throne room of heaven itself with his radiance. Armaros was there, he who knew the resolving of enchantments, the breaking of curses, the manipulation of spiritual forces beyond all human comprehension. Barakiel had come, master of the lightning and the stars, who had helped set the celestial bodies in their eternal courses at the very dawn of time when God spoke creation into being. Kokobel attended, he who had mapped the constellations and named each one of them in the musical language of angels. Ezekiel was present, he who understood the clouds and the weather and the deep mysteries of the atmosphere that surrounded the earth. Shamsiel had descended, he who knew the signs of the sun and all the secrets of fire and light. Sariel completed the company, he who comprehended the cycles of the moon and the movements of the tides across all the seas of the world. And 192 others had come as well, each one burning with a desire that should never have kindled in immortal hearts, each one willing to sacrifice eternity itself for a moment of forbidden pleasure with the daughters of men. They had watched humanity for generations beyond all counting from their posts in the heavenly realms. They had observed with growing fascination the sons and daughters of Adam multiplying across the face of the earth, building cities of stone and wood, planting gardens and vineyards, raising families in love and sometimes in strife, living their brief lives and dying in the short span allotted to mortal flesh. They had seen with particular interest the daughters of men grow in beauty with each passing generation, their forms becoming more graceful and full of life, their eyes brighter with the innocence and wonder of mortality, their voices rising in song and laughter that echoed sweetly across the valleys and plains. Something had stirred within the hearts of the watchers that defied their very nature as spiritual beings. They began to long intensely for what they could not have according to the laws of their creation. They began to desire with increasing desperation what was absolutely forbidden to them. They began to covet with shameful intensity the warmth of human touch, the intimacy of human love, the pleasure of human union that was reserved for mortal creatures alone. The burning in their hearts grew stronger with each passing year until it became an inferno of lust that consumed all reason, all loyalty, all memory of who they truly were and whom they had sworn to serve throughout eternity. Semjaza stood before his brothers in rebellion on that fateful night of nights, the cold wind whipping his magnificent robes around his form, the snow swirling around his feet like a living thing responding to his presence and his power. His face was illuminated by his own inner radiance that had once shone in the courts of the Most High, but there was something terribly different in his eyes now. Something hungry that had no place in an angel. Something desperate that betrayed his fall from grace. Something dark that had never been there in all the ages of his existence before this moment. He spoke into the silence of the gathered assembly, his voice carrying with supernatural clarity across the summit, despite the howling wind that should have torn his words apart before they reached any ears. He told them of his fears regarding what they were about to do. He knew better than any of them the consequences of what they contemplated together. This was not mere disobedience to a minor command of their creator, but cosmic treason of the highest order, a fundamental violation of the very boundaries God had established since the foundation of the world was laid in wisdom. Angels were spirit beings created to serve. Humans were flesh and blood creatures created to multiply. The two kinds were never meant to merge their essences together under any circumstances. But Semjaza also knew with terrible certainty that he could not resist the burning desire much longer. If they proceeded with their plan and the others later lost their nerve and repented, Semjaza warned with passion he alone as their leader would bear the full punishment for the great sin they had committed together. He would be made an eternal example of divine justice while they watched from the safety of heaven they had returned to, their desire forever unfulfilled, but their souls preserved from damnation. The others heard every word he spoke with perfect understanding. The others comprehended fully the weight of what he was proposing, and one by one, stepping forward with deliberate intention, they entered the circle of supernatural light that surrounded their leader. Their voices rose in firm agreement, 199 echoes of Semjaza's forbidden desire, declaring their solidarity. They would swear a binding oath that could never be broken. They would bind themselves together with mutual curses so terrible and so powerful that none among them could ever turn back from the path they chose, so that all would share equally in whatever judgment the Almighty might render against them. If they fell from grace, they would fall together as brothers in rebellion. If they burned in judgment, they would burn as one company united in their sin. The oath was spoken in the ancient tongue of heaven. The terrible words hung in the frozen air like smoke rising from a sacrifice, like incense burning before an unholy altar, like the last breath of innocence escaping before death claims it forever in its cold embrace. Each watcher in turn placed his hand upon the sacred stone at the summit of the mountain and swore by the name that cannot be spoken by mortal tongue, by the throne that cannot be approached by sinful flesh, by the glory that cannot be dimmed by any power in creation. They bound themselves with imprecations and curses so terrible in their power that even the howling wind seemed to recoil from them in horror and disgust. And in that fateful moment, the Watchers ceased forever to be guardians of humanity. They became instead its destroyers and corrupters. They called the mountain Hermon from that night forward, taking the name from the Hebrew word for curse, because they had cursed themselves with their own mouths and bound themselves by solemn and unbreakable oath to abandon heaven for earth, to trade eternity for a moment of pleasure, to exchange their divine purpose for human flesh and its brief satisfactions. The name would echo through all the ages of human history as a monument to their treachery, a warning to all who came after of the terrible consequences when the sacred boundaries of creation are violated by those who should know better. The descent began. The 200 Watchers came down from Hermon like stars falling from the sky in a shower of terrible beauty. Their heavenly radiance dimmed, but not completely extinguished, their spiritual forms shifting between the angelic and the human as they walked among the villages and cities of the antediluvian world, seeking what they desired. They were beautiful beyond all human description in their assumed forms, their faces perfect in every symmetry, their bodies magnificent in form and proportion, their eyes holding depths of knowledge and wisdom that made mortal men seem like mere infants by comparison. When they spoke, the very earth trembled beneath their feet in response. When they walked, flowers bloomed instantly in their footsteps and withered just as quickly when they passed. They carried with them the lingering scent of heaven itself, a fragrance of eternity and divine presence that intoxicated everyone who breathed it in and made them long for more. The daughters of men were utterly captivated by these glorious visitors. They came to the Watchers willingly and even eagerly. Drawn by a supernatural magnetism they could not resist no matter how they tried, their hearts pounding wildly in their chests, their minds clouded by a desire that seemed to come from somewhere outside themselves. The unions began in secret at first, hidden from the eyes of the community, conducted in tents pitched far from the villages and their gossip, in caves hidden deep in the hills where no one would find them, in sacred groves where the moonlight fell like silver rain upon the forbidden embraces of spirit and flesh. Semjaza took a wife first, a woman of extraordinary beauty, whose name would be forgotten by history, but whose womb would bear the first of the monstrosities that would plague the earth. Azazel followed close behind his leader's example. Then the others descended to claim their prizes. One by one, until all 200 had chosen partners from among the mortal daughters of men to satisfy their forbidden lusts, and the women conceived. But what began to grow within their wombs was not human in the ordinary sense of that word. It was not angel either, for angels do not reproduce as flesh does. It was something else entirely, a hybrid abomination that should never have existed in all of creation, a violation of every boundary God had established between species and kinds since the beginning of the world. The pregnancies were difficult beyond anything that midwives had ever seen in all their years of practice. The women suffered terribly as the months progressed, their bellies swelling to impossible and grotesque sizes, their bodies straining and often breaking under the weight of what they carried within them. Some died in childbirth when the time came for delivery, their fragile human frames simply too weak to bring forth the monsters they had conceived in forbidden union. Others survived the ordeal of birth, but were never the same afterward, their minds shattered by the trauma of what they had experienced, their bodies broken beyond any hope of repair, their eyes forever haunted by the memory of what they had brought into the world through their wombs. The children were born into the world screaming with voices of thunder, their cries shaking the very walls of the birthing chambers like violent earthquakes. They were massive from the first moment of their existence outside the womb, far larger than any human infant had ever been in all of history. Their eyes already open and aware of their surroundings, already filled with a hunger that nothing could satisfy. They grew at impossible and terrifying rates that defied all natural law, gaining in a single day what normal children gained in an entire year of development. By the time they could walk on their massive legs, they already towered over their human mothers who looked up at them in growing terror. By the time they could form words with their mouths, they had already begun to demand tribute and worship from the frightened people around them. They were called the Nephilim by all who saw them and trembled, the fallen ones, the giants, the heroes of old, the men of renown. Their physical size defied human comprehension and seemed to grow with each passing generation. Ancient texts preserved by the righteous spoke of their height reaching 300 cubits, measurements so vast that later scholars in distant ages would wonder if they were meant to be taken literally or merely symbolically. But there was no symbolism whatsoever in the terror they inspired wherever they walked upon the earth. The Nephilim were monsters clothed in flesh that appeared almost human, but was not, driven by appetites that could never be fully satisfied, haunted by a rage that had no source and no remedy, possessed by a hunger that consumed everything in its path and demanded ever more. They were neither fully angel in their nature nor fully human in their composition, belonging completely to neither realm that had produced them. They were outcasts of creation itself, anomalies of existence, living proof that some boundaries should never be crossed under any circumstances, and they were always desperately hungry. First, they devoured the produce of the earth that humans had cultivated with hard labor. Fields that had fed entire villages for generations were stripped completely bare in a matter of days. Granaries that had stored years of careful harvest were emptied in mere hours when the giants arrived demanding food. The Nephilim ate constantly without pause, their giant bodies requiring fuel that the earth could barely provide even at its most productive. Entire regions fell into devastating famine. People who had once been prosperous and well-fed found themselves starving and desperate, their crops all gone, their stores completely depleted, their livestock vanishing one by one into the gaping mouths of giants who demanded more and more and were never satisfied. But eventually, the food ran out completely, and the Nephilim were still hungry beyond all measure. They turned on the animals next, hunting down every living creature they could find across the land. Cattle, sheep, goats, deer, bears, lions, elephants. Nothing was too large for them to kill. Nothing was too dangerous for them to hunt. The giants pursued their prey with their bare hands, tearing apart beasts that would have killed any normal man with ease, drinking the warm blood that God had explicitly forbidden even to touch. Animal populations plummeted dramatically across all the earth. Species that had thrived since creation itself began to disappear entirely. The delicate balance of nature that God had established with such wisdom was thrown into utter chaos by the insatiable hunger of these hybrid monsters. But eventually the animals ran out completely as well, and the Nephilim were still hungry beyond all reason. They turned on humanity itself without remorse. If this story is touching your heart, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Here, every narrative is a journey through the sacred pages. And what comes next in the story of Enoch will shake the foundations of everything you thought you knew about angels, giants, and the judgment of God. The slaughter of human beings began slowly at first. Isolated incidents scattered across the land that people tried desperately to explain away as something other than what they truly were. A village attacked in the dark of night, every single inhabitant vanished without a trace by morning. A caravan that departed for a nearby city but never arrived at its destination. A family found torn apart in their own home, the walls splattered with blood and worse. But as the giants grew bolder in their predation and hungrier in their appetites, the attacks increased dramatically in both frequency and brutality. Men, women, children, the old and the young alike, the strong and the weak without distinction. It did not matter at all to the Nephilim who they consumed. They fed on human flesh with the same casual indifference that they had previously fed on cattle and sheep. They drank human blood still warm from the body. They ground human bones to powder between their massive teeth. They killed for food when they were hungry. They killed for sport when they were bored. They killed simply because something in their deeply corrupted nature demanded death and destruction and suffering without end or purpose. The entire earth was drowning in rivers of innocent blood. But the corruption spreading across the world did not end with the giants and their atrocities. The Watchers had brought more than their corrupted seed to earth when they descended from heaven. They had brought knowledge of things humans were never meant to know, secrets that had been reserved for immortal minds alone, mysteries that God had kept hidden in heaven for very good reasons. Azazel, the most cunning and knowledgeable among all the fallen Watchers, became the great teacher of forbidden arts to humanity. He gathered the men of the earth around him in secret assemblies, and when he opened his mouth to speak, the words that poured forth changed absolutely everything about human civilization. He taught them first to forge weapons of war with their own hands, swords and knives and shields and breastplates and spears and axes, instruments of death and destruction that had never before existed in all the world. Before Azazel shared his knowledge, men had settled their disputes with fists and stones and harsh words that could eventually be forgiven and forgotten. After Azazel taught them, they settled their differences with blades of bronze and iron that could slice through flesh and shatter bone, with armor that could turn aside any blow, with weapons that transformed every petty grievance into murder and every minor disagreement into wholesale massacre. He taught them metallurgy and all its secrets, how to extract iron and bronze and copper and tin from the raw earth, how to heat these metals in furnaces until they ran like water, how to shape the molten metal into tools of destruction. Forges sprang up in every village across the land. Smiths worked day and night without rest to produce more and more weapons. The sound of hammer on metal became the constant heartbeat of a dying world. He taught the women the arts of seduction and vanity with equal enthusiasm, the use of antimony to paint their eyes, making them seem larger and darker and more alluring than nature had intended, the crafting of bracelets and anklets and necklaces and rings, jewelry that caught the light and drew the gaze of every man who passed by, the mixing of perfumes and oils that inflamed desire beyond all reason. the dyeing of hair and cloth in bright colors that nature had never intended for human adornment. Before Azazel shared these secrets, women had been modest and pure in their presentation, content with the natural beauty God had given them at creation. After Azazel taught them, they became weapons in an endless war of seduction and manipulation, instruments of temptation, their bodies displayed and decorated to inspire uncontrollable lust in every man who saw them. Marriages crumbled everywhere, families shattered into bitter pieces. The sacred bond between husband and wife became a mockery and a joke told by the corrupt. Other watchers followed Azazel's example eagerly, each teaching the forbidden knowledge of their particular specialty to willing human students. Semjaza taught enchantments and the cutting of roots for potions and powerful spells of binding and cursing. He revealed the dark secrets of sorcery, how to manipulate spiritual forces that humans had never known existed, how to curse enemies and bless allies and bind spirits and loose demons through words of power. His students became the first witches and warlocks, practitioners of dark arts that would plague humanity for millennia to come. Amaros taught how to resolve and break the enchantments that others cast, creating a dark economy of magic and counter-magic where power went to whoever knew the most forbidden secrets. Barakiel revealed the mysteries of astrology, teaching men to read their fate in the movements of the stars and to worship the creation rather than the creator who had made it all. Kokabel mapped all the constellations in detail and taught divination from their patterns. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of clouds and weather manipulation for selfish purposes. Shamsiel revealed the signs of the sun and secrets of fire that could be used for destruction. Sariel disclosed the mysteries of the moon and its influence over human emotions and tides. The forbidden knowledge spread like plague through a crowded city with no cure. Within a single generation, the world was completely transformed beyond all recognition. Villages became fortresses bristling with weapons of war. Tribes became armies marching under banners of conquest. The peace that had existed since Eden was shattered utterly by the clash of bronze against bronze, and the screams of the dying on battlefields everywhere. Wars erupted in every corner of the earth, fueled by new weapons of destruction and old grievances that had once been forgotten but now demanded blood. Men who had once been friendly neighbors faced each other across fields of battle, their swords dripping with blood, their hearts hardened by hatred taught to them by fallen angels. Religion itself was corrupted beyond recognition. Men who had once walked with God in righteousness now bowed before altars of their own making, offering sacrifices to demonic powers they did not understand. The Nephilim demanded worship as gods, and they received it from a terrified population that saw no alternative but submission. Temples were built throughout the land to honor the giants, massive monuments of stone that testified to humanity's enslavement. Priests emerged who served not the Creator, but the creation, who taught not holiness, but abomination, who led the people not toward heaven, but toward hell. The knowledge of the true God faded like morning mist before the rising sun of wickedness. Only a few righteous souls still remembered the ways of their fathers. Only a few still prayed to the God who seemed to have abandoned the earth. And the blood of the innocent continued to flow like rivers to the sea. The earth itself seemed to cry out under the unbearable weight of violence, groaning like a woman in the agony of labor, screaming for deliverance that would not come. The souls of the murdered rose toward heaven in an endless stream, their voices joining together in a chorus of accusation against the fallen angels, demanding justice, demanding vengeance, demanding that someone somewhere with power would finally put an end to the nightmare that had consumed all creation. Heaven heard their cries. In the highest realms of glory, where the throne of God blazed with light that made the sun seem like a flickering candle by comparison, 4 archangels of supreme power stood before the Almighty. Michael, the prince of the heavenly host, greatest warrior among all the angels. Gabriel, the messenger of God, who carried divine proclamations throughout creation. Raphael, the healer of heaven, whose touch could cure any wound or disease. Uriel, the light of God, keeper of knowledge and guardian of sacred mysteries. They had been watching the tragedy unfold on earth. They had been waiting for divine instruction. And now at last, they spoke their report. They told God what he already knew with perfect completeness. They described in terrible detail the corruption that had spread across the entire earth. They spoke with righteous anger of Azazel's forbidden teachings and Semjaza's cosmic rebellion. They testified concerning the Nephilim and their countless atrocities against humanity, the rivers of blood, the endless violence, the suffering of the innocent that never ceased. They reported that the souls of the murdered were crying out from the ground itself, that creation was being systematically undone by the very beings who had been assigned to protect it. And God responded with finality. His voice rolled through the halls of heaven like thunder echoing through mountain valleys, like waves crashing on shores of crystal, like fire consuming everything in its path. The verdict was absolute and without appeal. The sentence was final and irrevocable. The judgment would be complete and total. Raphael was commanded first to deal with Azazel, the teacher of forbidden knowledge. The healer of heaven would become the executioner of divine justice. He was sent with all his power to seize the teacher of forbidden arts wherever he hid, to bind him hand and foot with unbreakable chains, to drag him to a desolate and forsaken place in the wilderness called Dudael, where no one lived or would ever live. There, Raphael would cast Azazel into an opening in the earth, onto rough and jagged rocks that would tear his flesh for all eternity. His face would be covered in absolute darkness, so that he would never see light again. He would lie there in torment, bound and bleeding and forgotten, until the great day of final judgment, when he would be thrown into eternal fire that would never be quenched. To Azazel was ascribed all sin committed on the earth since his teachings began. Gabriel was commanded next to deal with the monstrous Nephilim. The messenger of God would become the instigator of their complete destruction. He was sent with authority to stir up war among the giants themselves, to plant seeds of suspicion and hatred and jealousy that would blossom into genocide. The Nephilim would destroy themselves. Brother would turn against brother in bloody combat. The strongest would hunt the weakest for sport and food. The survivors would feast on the fallen bodies of their own kin until none remained alive upon the earth. They would tear each other apart until the last giant lay dead in a pool of corrupted blood. Michael was commanded finally to deal with Semjaza and all the remaining watchers. The warrior of heaven would become their eternal jailer. He was sent to bind them with chains that could never be broken by any power, to cast them into hidden valleys beneath the hills of the earth where no light penetrated, to imprison them in absolute darkness for 70 generations of human time. But before their imprisonment, they would be forced to watch the destruction of everything they had created. They would see their giant children turn on each other. They would hear the screams of the Nephilim dying in agony. They would witness the complete and utter annihilation of their monstrous offspring, and they would be absolutely helpless to stop any of it. But before any of this divine judgment could begin, God had one more important task. A message had to be delivered to the rebels. A witness had to be sent to pronounce the verdict, and there was only one man on all the earth righteous enough to carry the judgment of heaven to the watchers who had betrayed it. His name was Enoch. In the midst of this nightmare of blood and corruption, one man alone had walked a completely different path. Enoch had taken a wife in his youth and fathered a son whom he named Methuselah, a name that was itself a prophecy, meaning when he dies, it shall be sent. Enoch did not fully understand what would be sent. or when it would come, but he knew with certainty that his son's life was a countdown to something cataclysmic. As the world descended into chaos all around him, Enoch drew ever closer to God. He walked with the Almighty in intimate fellowship in a way that no man had walked with God since Adam left the Garden of Eden in shame. He prayed without ceasing. He listened constantly for the voice of God speaking to his heart. He walked through a world gone completely mad, and he absolutely refused to join in the madness. And God noticed his faithfulness. The voice came to Enoch like thunder wrapped in silk, overwhelming yet intimate, terrifying yet comforting. God commanded him to go to the Watchers, to seek them out wherever they had hidden themselves, and to deliver a message they would never be able to forget. Enoch obeyed without hesitation. He traveled north, toward the slopes of Hermon, toward the place where it had all begun. The journey took many days through a devastated landscape. He walked through villages that had been destroyed, past fields stripped bare, around mountains where giants still roamed. He saw bodies piled in ditches, children wandering alone, altars stained with blood, but he did not turn back. God had sent him. He found the Watchers at Abel's-Yael, between Lebanon and Sinir. They were gathered there, the 200 who had sworn the oath, now haunted by consequences. They sat with faces covered, weeping. When they saw Enoch approaching, they knew judgment had come. Semjaza begged Enoch to intercede, to carry a petition to the Most High, to ask for mercy. Enoch agreed. He went to the waters of Dan. He wrote out their request. He prayed. He fasted. And as sleep took him, a vision came. The dream began in fire. Enoch was lifted from the earth, carried through clouds that burned with colors he could not name. He saw the storehouses of rain, the pillars of the firmament, the foundations of the earth. He traveled until he came to a place of absolute desolation. No sky above, no ground beneath, only chaos and flame and darkness. 7 stars burned there, rolling over fire that consumed them without destroying them. These were angels who had rebelled, imprisoned for 10,000 years. This is the prison of the stars. The angel led him further. A great abyss opened, deeper than thought. Columns of fire descended into its depths. From the depths came wailing. This is the prison prepared for the Watchers. Here they will be confined forever. Enoch wept. The angel carried him higher through the 7 heavens until they came to a house built of crystal surrounded by fire. Fiery cherubim moved within, and beyond them stood a throne. The one upon it blazed with glory brighter than lightning. Enoch fell on his face. The Most High spoke. The petition was denied. There would be no forgiveness, no mercy. The sentence was absolute. Go back. Tell them their petition is denied. Tell them they will be bound for 70 generations. Tell them they have no peace. Enoch returned and delivered the verdict. The hope in their eyes died. God continued to reveal mysteries. The coming flood, Noah as salvation's vessel, and Enoch wrote it all down. Years passed. Then came the day. Enoch was 365 years old. He had walked faithfully, and God took him. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, the first human to enter heaven alive. The flood came in Noah's days. The Nephilim drowned. The Watchers screamed in their prisons, but no one heard. Thousands of years have passed, but Enoch's story endures because it is true. The angels remain bound, awaiting judgment. Enoch's testimony stands as witness. That God sees, that God judges, that God redeems, that one righteous man can become a beacon of light for all generations. His legacy is a warning and a promise. The same God who took Enoch watches over you. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. The invitation remains open. Heaven is still watching. If this story touched your heart, write in the comments. I choose to walk with God.